Jenna, and I hope you enjoy it. It's just going to be a reading from a book on Marilyn Monroe. She was born on June 1st, 1926, at 9:30 in the morning. An easy birth, easiest of her mother's 3 deliveries. As the world knows, it was out of wedlock. At the time of Marilyn's first marriage to James Dougherty, the name of Norma Jean Baker was put on the marriage license, Baker by way of her mother's first husband. On the second marriage to Joe DiMaggio, the last name became Mortensen, taken from the second husband. Even the middle name Jean was originally written as Jean with an E, a quintessentially prairie spelling, like Corian for Corin. There is no need to look for any purpose behind the use of the names. Uneducated, that familiar woe of a beautiful blonde, she was also cultureless. Can we guess she would not care to say whether Rococo was 300 years before the Renaissance? Any more than she would be ready to swear the retreat of Napoleon from Moscow didn't come because his railroad trains couldn't run in the cold. Historically empty, she was nonetheless sensitive, as sensitive as she was historically empty, and her normal state, when not under too much sedation, was by many an account vibrant to new perception. It is as if she was ready when accelerated to reach out to the washes of a psychedelic tide. So talking to one publicity man, it would seem natural in the scheme of things that her last name was Baker. Maybe that sounded better as she looked at the man's nose. Another flack was something flaccid in the look of his muscles from the solar plexus to the gut would inspire Mortensen. Since it was all movie publicity, nobody bothered to check. To what end? Who knew the real legal situation? If the mother, Gladys Monroe Baker, had been married to Edward Mortensen, an itinerant lover, he had already disappeared by the time Marilyn was born. Some reports even had him dead of a motorcycle accident before Norma Jean was conceived. There may also have been some question whether Gladys Monroe was ever divorced from the first husband Baker or merely separated. And the real father, according to Fred Gills, was C. Stanley Gifford, an employee of Consolidated Film Industries, where Gladys Baker worked, a handsome man. Shown a picture of him by her mother when still a child, Marilyn described him later, wearing a slouch hat cocked on one side of his head. He had a little mustache and a smile. He looked kind of like Clark Gable, you know, strong and manly. In her early teens, she kept a picture of Gable on her wall and lied to high school friends that Gable was her secret father. Not too long out of the orphanage where she had just spent 21 months, then veteran of numerous foster homes, it is obvious she was looking for a sense of self-importance. But we may as well assume something more extravagant. The demand upon a biographer is to explain why she is exceptional. So in that part of her adolescent mind, where fantasy washes reality, as the ego begins to emerge, it is possible she is already, like Richard Nixon, searching for an imperial sense of self-justification. Illegitimate she might be, but still selected for a high destiny. Clark Gable was her secret father. That she would yet come to know Gable while making the Misfits, know him toward the end of her life, when in the infernal wastes of that psychic state where the brimstone of insomnia and barbiturates is boiled, her marriage to Miller already lost, her lateness a disease more debilitating than palsy. What portent she must have sensed, playing love scenes at last with the secret father. What a cacophony of cries in the silence of her head, when Gable was dead 11 days after finishing the film. But then omens surrounded her like the relative she never had at a family dinner. If her footprints fit Valentino's about the time she became a star, so too was a bowl of tomato sauce dropped on her groom's white jacket the day of her first wedding, and down she was turned, down a hall with no exit, in City Hall in San Francisco, just before she married Joe DiMaggio. Little fish of intimation, too small for a biographer to fry, but remembered perhaps when a woman reporter was killed chasing after her in a sports car the day she was getting married to Miller. And Marilyn was having her period that day. What a vision of blood. A woman smashed and dead on the day she is joining herself to the one man she may be convinced she does love. It is not sedative for a young woman whose sense of her own sanity can never be secure. She has no roots but illegitimacy on one side and a full pedigree of insanity on the other. Her grandfather Monroe, who would naturally claim to be descendant from President Monroe, had spent the last part of his life committed to a state asylum. Monroe's wife, Marilyn's grandmother, Della Monroe Granger, a beauty with red hair and green-blue eyes, had insane rages on quiet suburban, semi-slum streets in environs of Los Angeles like Hawthorne, and was also committed to a mental hospital before she died. So was Marilyn's mother in an asylum for most of Marilyn's life, and the brother of the mother killed himself. When the wings of insanity beat thus near, one pays attention to a feather. The most causal coincidence is obliged to seem another warning from the deep. So must it have been like opening the door to a secret room and finding that it looks exactly as envisioned. To know that the director of her first starring movie, Don't Bother to Knock, about a girl who was mad, should have the name of Baker. Still, these reinforced roots of insanity and this absence of clear identity are not only a weakness, but an intense motive to become an actor. In the logic of transcendence, every weakness presupposes the possibility of a future strength. Great actors usually discover they have a talent by first searching in desperation for an identity. It is no ordinary identity that will suit them, and no ordinary desperation can drive them. The force that propels a great actor in his youth is insane ambition. Illegitimacy and insanity are the godparents of the great actor. A child who is missing either parent is a study in the search for identity and quickly becomes a candidate for actor. since the most creative way to discover a new and possible identity is through the close fit of a role. But then the origins of insanity can also be glimpsed in wild and unmanageable ambition. While the appearance of insanity is not ever simple, and two insane people are rarely alike, except when in depression, still the root of insanity is easier to locate than sanity, for it is more single-minded. The root is to be found in frustrated ambition, no more, provided we conceive the true pain of such a state, an undying will existing in conditions of hopeless entombment. To be buried alive is insanity. What creates such complexity in the mad, that labyrinth of interlocking selves with every knotted incapacity to act on simple lines, is the reaction of thwarted will upon every structure of the character. While the cause of insanity is therefore as simple as the process that makes an enlargement, where a focus of light burns in, distorts, dodges, or solarizes the original negative, still the content of the insanity is not simple, for it must remain at least as complex as the content of the negative itself, that is, the complexity of the original character. Coffee break. While formal psychiatry is a maze of medical disciplines that seek to cure, stupefy, or pulverize madness, it is another kind of inquiry to search into the uncontrollable ambition to dominate one's own life, the life of others, or the life of communities not yet conceived, that simple rage to put one's signature upon existence. Let us bow our heads. If we want to comprehend the insane, then we must question the fundamental notion of modern psychiatry, that we have but one life and one death. The concept that no human being has ever existed before, or will be reincarnated again, is the philosophical rule of thumb which dominates psychiatry. Yet all theory built upon this concept has failed. One is tempted to say systematically, in every effort to find a consistent method of cure for psychotics. Even the least spectacular processes of reasoning may therefore suggest that to comprehend psychosis and the psychology of those who are exceptional, like our heroine, it could be time to look upon human behavior as possessed of a double root. While the dominant trunk of our actions has to be influenced by the foreground of our one life here and now and living, the other root may be attached to some karmic virtue or debt, some of us or all of us, acquired by our courage or failure in lives we have already lived. If such theory is certainly supported by no foundation, nonetheless it offers some immediate assistance for comprehending the insane, since it would suggest we are not all conceived in equal happiness or desperation. Any human who begins life with the debt of owing existence somewhat more than others is thereby more likely to generate an ambition huge enough to swallow old debts. and be less content with modest success. Of course, the failure of such ambition must double all desperation. Double entry bookkeeping on a celestial level. I stub my toe because of a leap taken in another life. Then I fight with my wife because once I disputed in similar circumstances with my 14th century mother. Absurdities eat into the argument with the ferocity of ants. Yet if we are to understand Monroe, and no one has, we have only seen her limned as an angelic and sensitive victim, or a murderous emotional cripple. Why not assume that in a family of such concentrated insanity as her own, the illegitimate daughter of Gladys Monroe Baker may have been born with a desperate imperative formed out of all those previous debts and failures of her whole family of souls. And the imperative may have been to display herself as a presence to the world, there to leaven the thickening air with the tender, wise, and witty flesh of an angel of redacted conscience of how this presence may have been managed and directed and advanced, its insufferably difficult way forward by a harsh and near to maniacal voice of the most inward concealed and secretive desperation, since the failure of her project was insanity, or some further variety of doom. We draw back from such a projection. It is too much, and much too soon. She was a dumb and redacted broad. A voice of outraged bitterness is bound to say, a dizzy dish with a flare and a miserable childhood, and much good and bad luck, and she took a little talent a long way. You could go to any southern town and find 12 of her. A familiar voice. It is comfortable. Yet facing the phenomenon of her huge appeal to the world, Napoleonic was her capture of the attention of the world. Let us at least recognize that the reductive voice speaks with no more authority than the romantic, that it is also an unproved thesis, and does no more than scorn the first thesis. Indeed, it fails to explain her altogether. There are a million dumb and dizzy broads with luck, and none come near to Monroe. No. To explain her at all, let us hold to that karmic notion as one more idea to support in our mind while trying to follow the involuted pathways of her life. While Gladys Baker, the mother, worked as a film technician, that was probably no more of a coincidence than if we were to read that the father of a brilliant automotive engineer had been a foreman on a Detroit assembly line. For that matter, Gladys Baker was a foreman, a section head with 5 girls under her. Their job at Consolidated Film Industries was to splice together processed negatives. The father, at least the man considered to be the father by the reckoning of most of Gladys's fellow workers, was also employed at Consolidated. He had a romance with Gladys that lasted for several months, a fair period for C. Stanley Gifford, since he was known in the company as a lover, and therefore did not usually take long to move on. Hollywood, in 1926, being more tolerant of broken, redacted Moors than other places, a collection was taken up among Gladys's co-workers to help with the expenses of the delivery. The sum came to $140, which in those days may have paid most of the bills at Los Angeles General Hospital. Gifford did not contribute. The psychology of the stud speaks in his silence. Considering the sweat that, redacted, cost me. Of course, Gladys Baker, known as the slave driver of a foreman, was sharp-tongued. 25 years later, Marilyn discovered her father was a successful dairyman living in Hemet, California, and put in a call to visit, for she had never seen him. He would not come to the phone. He suggests, said his wife, you see his lawyer in Los Angeles if you have some complaint. Do you have a pencil? Is Gifford a small-town monument to bad conscience, afraid of his wife, or profoundly suspicious of the financial intentions of long-lost bastards? Perhaps he is the holder of an enduring grudge. We can as easily assume some evaluation of his manhood was left in the flesh by Gladys Baker. In any case, 2.5 decades later, he was small prize to a young woman looking for her identity. Probably his greatest gift to the illegitimate daughter had been libido. It is no accident that studs are usually heartless about the aftermath. By their logic, they have already treated the mother well and given the baby a good beginning. If his abandoned daughter would be obliged to look harder for a father than anyone in American life since Thomas Wolfe, well, that by his logic was the balance of justice. The mother, after all, had looked for a stud. If it is the acme of the facetious to speculate about the character of her father, we cannot remind ourselves often enough that little as we know about C. Stanley Gifford, we know less about Mr. Monroe, the grandfather, not even his first name. We can be told that Della Monroe Granger, Marilyn's grandmother, was born Hogan, from a lower middle-class family of Hogans in the state of Missouri, and came west when adolescent. Later traveled to India after her second husband Granger had been sent there by the oil company for which he worked. We also know she was a follower of Amy Semple McPherson and went to prayer service regularly at Angelus Temple. Even had Norma Jean baptized by Amy in the Foursquare Gospel Church when Della came back to Hawthorne from India. Alone. Her marriage with Granger terminated. The baby, Norma Jean, now 6 months old, was living across the street with a family named Bolinder, who were foster parents, for the reasonable sum of $5 a week. And on Saturdays, Gladys Baker took the long trolley ride from her furnished home in Hollywood. Where she was working once more at Consolidated, out to Hawthorne. The supposition was that she could stay overnight and thereby be with the baby again on Sunday, but usually she had a date for Saturday night in Hollywood and took the trolley back. The date was necessary if she thought to find a husband and make a home for her daughter, but it is not difficult to conceive of lonely, arid afternoon hours spent in the Bollinger home with an infant that was hers and yet strange to her. This small, handsome mother, with a resemblance to the young Gloria Swanson, whose face stares out of a photograph with clear and elegant features. There she is, again unphotographed, in the Bollinger living room, holding her infant, a love child. We have to recognize the measure of the decision. If abortions were not routine in 1926, still they were available in Hollywood. Some inner imperative may have told her the child was too special to abort, for it was clear she was not sentimental about babies. Her first husband, Baker, had permanent possession of her other two children. Gladys even listed them as dead when admitted to the hospital for Norma Jean's birth, and they may have been as dead to her as the dead love of that past, which married her to Baker in Mexico at the age of 15. What a life had Gladys Monroe Baker before she was even 25. Now the child who had disrupted her chance for a career or an advantageous marriage was in her arms. Inspector of Family Insanity was boring her, was remote from her. Strange infant, strange project to which she had committed herself for a purpose she could not now name. Nor as she sits on Saturday afternoon in a home so religious, a colored poster of Christ is on the living room wall. Mr. Bollinger, a mail carrier, prints up religious pamphlets on a press he has in a workshop at the end of the house. Across the street from the Bollingers is the house of her mother, another one-story stucco bungalow with a veranda and a scraggly palm tree in the front yard. And to spend time with Della Granger is worse than to spend time with the Bollingers. Coffee break. Her mother's rages are even more unpredictable than her own, although probably no worse than her father's. The one memory of Gladys's father which comes down to us is how Mr. Monroe once pulled a pet kitten out of his daughter's hands and threw it against a wall. We can see that near insane man with his profound vision of darkest dalliances between women and cats as he stands in the presence of his wife, a most violent-tempered red-haired witch, and of his daughter, showing every sign of soon growing into a witch as she plays with the kitten, while he, descendant of President Monroe, and now married all the way down to a green-eyed, red-headed Hogan with heirs, will not yet be dominated in his own home. Death to cats. He believes God will applaud him. Yes, the baby means incarceration for a weekend, with the timid sanctity of the Bollingers or the on-off rages of her screaming, deserted, and ladylike mother. While back in Hollywood, trolley ride to the other end of endless Los Angeles. They have just been making The Jazz Singer with Al Jolson, Greta Garbo and Joan Crawford, Gloria Swanson and Clara Bow, Constance Bennett and Norma Talmadge are stars. Norma Jean has, we may as well guess, even been named after Norma Talmadge. But then Gladys also has a resemblance to her. John Barrymore, a very handsome version of Gifford, is a leading man, and John Gilbert and Adolphe Menjou, Valentino, in whose footprints Gladys's daughter will stand, has just died. He is the only one of those strong and manly lovers without a mustache. Of course, Gladys will stay overnight in Hawthorne now and again, and go to Sunday sermon with the Bollanders, carrying Norma Jean in her arms. The baby will rarely cry. Indeed, later when Norma Jean can walk, Gladys will occasionally take her to the film lab and let her sit there quietly while she works. Workers congratulate the mother for her good child, but it is as likely a first sign of the spiritual orphan who does not expect attention. And in later years, the comments on such calm behavior will be less adulatory. Natasha Lattès, once her dramatic coach, later ignominiously dismissed, was to say, I often felt she was somnambulist, walking around. Excuse me. My ignorance is showing. And Nunnally Johnson, the scriptwriter, described her as 10 feet underwater, a wall of thick cotton. She reminds me of a sloth. You stick a pin in her, and 8 days later, it says ouch. Already in infancy, it is possible her thoughts are turning circular and bear the same relation to purposeful inquiry that the steps of a prisoner pacing a cell offer to a journey. On most Sundays, however, the well-behaved baby did not see the inside of church with her mother. The mother was in Hollywood, awakening after a Saturday night without her. Is it safe to assume Gladys never felt closer to the baby than when she was without her? But the emotional impost of going to Hawthorne was steadily on the increase. Della was each week less stable. If she were always capable of shrieking at delivery boys one day, then being gracious the next, one newsboy was now so terrified of her that he asked his supervisor to send the weekly bill by mail. And Ida Bolander, caught in the act of spanking Norma Jean for upsetting a bowl of food, heard Della scream, Don't ever let me catch you doing that again. Her voice must have had that recognizable tone which speaks of the blood of my blood. For Ida Bolander, never a bold woman, was thereafter in fear of Della, and forever worried when Della, rising at last to a grandmotherly function, would take Norma Jean across the street for a visit. Ida dares not interfere, and yet is resentful, one might as well assume, since Della, if just turned 50, is still sufficiently beautiful to play the dilettante even as a grandmother. It is the classic American small-town comedy. People are going mad on quiet, shabby end-of-town streets, while envy is generated, proprietaries are abused, and properties are maintained. Yet the fundamental sense of the American madness, that violence which lives like an electronic hum behind the silence of even the sleepiest Sunday afternoon, is incubating in the balmy, smog-free, subtropical evenings of Hollywood. The vision of the American frontier has gone into a light box and come out as a 10-foot ghost upon a screen. I think next time I'm going to pick a happier story to read for bedtime. I will definitely do that. Thank you so much for bearing with me during my cold, and I will see you on the next live stream. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and join for more content. And thank you again for joining me. Be well, stay wild as well.